Howdy.
Howdy. Hello.
Howdy.
Howdy!
I'm on Texas.
We're not. I'm not even from Texas, but I live there, so we do that. Welcome everyone to our panel session on RPG theory and history. Thanks for coming. We're excited to hear and learn. So I'd like to very quickly. So we're going to hear from doctors Bill White, Jose Zagal, and Evan Turner. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Zagal, so I'll introduce him first. So Jose P. Zagal is an associate professor with the University of Utah's Entertainment Arts and Engineering program. He wrote Ludoliteracy in 2010 and edited the Video Game Ethics Reader in 2012. In 2016, he was honored as a distinguished scholar by the Digital Games Research Association for his contributions to the field of game research. He also serves as the editor-in-chief in Diagra's flagship journal, Transactions of Digital Games Research Association. He received his PhD in computer science from Georgia Institute of Technology. So let's give him a round of applause.
My accomplice, Sebastian Dierling, who's pictured there on the right. I'll be talking today about a project that we have been working with, collaborating on for a long time now, together with a whole bunch of other people. But I just want to make it clear that anything I say, if you don't like it, you can attribute that to me. If you really like it, attribute it to him. If you're like, it could be either of us. Okay? So just so we're clear. My words are as much his as his on this subject, or as much mine as well. Okay, so in late 2012, I was on a discussion list. It was a discussion list hosted by the Digital Games Research Association, aka DIGRA. And DIGRA has lots of discussion lists. If you've heard of Games Network, that's the main DIGRA mailing list. But in particular, DIGRA has a special interest group for role-playing game studies. And this special interest group had its own list, which is the roleplaying@digra.org. And so people started arguing on this list, asking questions and sort of fighting the way academics do, in a very sort of polite fashion, about things. People were wondering what other people were doing as they were teaching or talking about RPGs in their classrooms. So saying, hey, I want to teach a class, or what should I do, who should I go to? People saying, well, I teach a class that has a unit on open games, and so on and so forth. Did I say that right? Yes. Okay. There's also discussion about what the canonical literature was. So if I'm just starting out, what should I read? What should I be aware of? Or what should I make sure my students are aware of? What should they know? Academics like to complain about a lot of things. There's a lot of complaints about, hey, I'm really angry because no one ever cites this thing, which is really important. Or no one ever talks about this thing, which is really old and really also really important, and so on. And so how do we make sure that this literature that is important to different people is still, remains in awareness? Okay, how do we stop ignoring earlier work, recognize it, incorporate it into what we're doing now, and so on? And sort of the big, I guess, finale of this whole discussion, in some sense, was, hey, we don't have a textbook for any of this, and that's a problem, right? What should we do about that? So 1 year later, together with Sebastian, we organized a workshop at the Defragging Game Studies conference, that's a DIGRA conference in 2013 in Atlanta, Georgia. The theme of the conference was Defragging Game Studies. And this workshop was called Role-Playing Game Studies, a Handbook. And our goal was to gather researchers, academics, scholars from wherever they might have been into a single room to talk about this question of this textbook that we don't have, what should it be like? And if you're interested in this textbook coming into existence, hey, why don't you show up in the room and you can help shape that discussion. So basically we wanted people that were willing to put some time and effort into putting together a book that hopefully consolidated scholarly work in RPGs, also integrated RPGs across their different forms. So realized pretty quickly that when people said role-playing game studies, for some people that meant Larp, for some people that meant MMOs, and for some people that meant, I don't know, what is this role-playing thing anyways in the first place? But I'm a psychologist and we talk about roles all the time. Our idea here was that this would be the main textbook or handbook, a sort of a reference guide for this idea of role-playing game studies as a field or as a discipline. I was actually able to recover sort of the links of the stuff that we presented. This is, 5 years ago at this point. So if you're curious, what we were talking about 5 years ago, you can follow those too. I also found pictures of the whiteboard. So we had this long discussion. It was about an hour and a half about what the book could be. And in hindsight, I look at it now and I say, yeah, that was pretty. We managed to steer that ship pretty close to what we wanted to. So over on the right there, it says in red, so circled in red, reference, well actually rectangled in red. So we didn't want to make it a book that was about design. We didn't want to make a book that was about further research. So it wasn't necessarily pushing the boundary. We wanted to make sure we hit laymen, fans, undergrads, designers, scholars, and RPG scholars. It's the red on the right there. And the basic level was about an undergraduate level. So all those things still apply, and I'm kind of proud of that. Because over the past few years, I'm actually going to read these to make sure that everyone is recognized. Yoni Arianta, Whitney Beltran, Raphael Bienia, Stefan Bjork, Sarah-Lynn Bowman, Simon Brind, Amanda Brown, Ashley Brown, Edward Casanova, Mark Chen, Jessica Hammer, Tuomas Harvianen, Michael Hitchens, Sarah Hoover, David Chara, Jeff Kaufman, David Kirshner, Isaac Knowles, Jaroslav Kott, Riley Leary, Andreas Liberos, Esther McCallum Stewart, David Melman, Nicholas Meiser, John Peterson, Martin McCard, Karen Schreier, Douglas Schultz, David Simpkins, Jakob Stenros, Ian Stewart, Alexander Toe, Evan Torner, Aaron Trammell, Moira Turkington, Jonathan Walton, William White, Patrick Williams, together with Sebastian and myself, planned, outlined, wrote, reviewed, and revised this book. So it's more than 40 people. So why do I want to list everyone? Why did I take the time, and your time as well, to read everything? Because I want to make sure that you all understand that this wasn't sort of my project or Sebastian's project. It was really a whole group of a community that sort of came together around this project. It was a true collaborative writing project. I'm sure many of you have read or seen edited collections that are collections. So you invite people to participate, they send their things in, and then you get this book, and they're kind of thematically coherent. This was a project where we decided we wanted to write the book as if we were one author, but there was actually 40 of us, and so how were we going to do that? And so the planning of what the book was, the outline of what the book was going to be, fleshing out that outline, all that was work that everyone sort of participated and collaborated. Everyone signed up to write the chapters that they felt they wanted to write. Everyone also signed up to review and sort of revise the chapters that they were interested in, but perhaps didn't have enough time to write. And we went through at least 4 revisions for each of the chapters, which is a lot. What you most often see is, first version, comments, come back, revision, and then you're done, right? And when I say 4 revisions, these are significant editorial revisions. So that doesn't include typesetting, that doesn't include layout, any of those. Those are sort of additional revisions too. So this is a lot of, I don't want to call it churn because that sounds really negative, but there's a lot of iteration on each of these chapters. Some of it involved cutting pieces out of one chapter and putting them in a different chapter. Some of it just involved trimming stuff out because this is really interesting, but this book needs to maintain its focus. We didn't want the book to be too large. We want it to be sort of digestible, making sure that we were being as consistent as possible in terms of the voice and so on. So it was a crazy adventure in that sense. I'd never participated in a project of this size and scope. That was also attempting to be as inclusive and collaborative as possible. Our job, as in Sebastian's, my jobs, that was a lot of cats and a lot of herding, and academics are really ornery cats to herd. I include myself in that ship for sure. So the book came out. It came out in March of this year, just a couple of months ago. It's called Role-Playing Game Studies, Transmedia Foundations. I have a link up at the end so you can see it on the publisher. There's also a discount code if you want to buy it. I apologize for the sort of the sales pitchy part of this presentation. In fact, perhaps the whole presentation is basically about the book. I'm really excited by it. I've worked really hard on it, as you can imagine. But I really want to encourage you to take a look at it. And I'm grateful if you choose to buy it. I'm also grateful if you just choose to be interested in it. That's cool. Okay, so the main focus of my talk today, and I hope someone is keeping time because otherwise I will totally run over, is sort of this big picture of role-playing game studies. I am aware that I'm at a Larp conference with a lot of people that are really here for Larp, but I'm assuming that you're at least RPG friendly in the context of other kinds of RPGs that are out there. So I want to hopefully I'm going to preach to the choir. I assume you're already sort of invested in Larp, and maybe help us take us bigger places or better places, or remind ourselves of why LARPs are interesting, why RPGs are interesting, and why all this matters in the grand scheme of things. So you might be wondering, RPG studies? I'm not an academic, that sounds kind of interesting, but what do you really mean by that? So I thought I'd list all the different flavors that we have seen so far of what it means to be in RPG studies. So it's looking at role-play, looking at role-playing, looking at role-playing games. These are all sort of very different things depending on where you're coming from. Looking at role-players, the people that are engaged, the communities, the groups, the artifacts, the manuals, the books, the props, the costumes, so on and so forth, the computer programs, the code. Looking at the role of role-play in society at large, the role of role-play in culture, uses and benefits of role-play, what it means to role-play in the first place. Basically anything or everything that has to do with role play. So this is more than just games, right? We think of role-playing games, we think of it as a subset of this bigger picture, this bigger idea of role-playing in general. Okay. So to start, I think we need to recognize things, right? We all role-play. That is hopefully obvious. And it means that in our lives, we assume different identities depending on what context we're playing. Right now, I'm in a presenter context. That is the role that I'm playing right here. I am the expert, and you are all the audience, right? And we're having a special interaction, which is defined by social conventions and cultural conventions as well. When I go home, I'm the parent, right? I'm the spouse, and so on and so forth. Okay. And this idea of enacting different roles is actually a fundamental part of the human condition. It's what drives our social interactions, it's what drives our culture as well. And in particular, we have a very specific form of cultural expression, which are games. And when D&D came out in the 1970s, it basically changed the game, where all of a sudden, this activity that we do in our regular lives that we have always done for thousands of years, as long as we've had culture and society, it became now a new form, a new activity, right? A new genre of leisure. And so role-playing games, as we understand them nowadays, and to be fair, I'm saying in the tradition coming from sort of D&D, and everything that happened since, it's exploded in all kinds of directions, role-playing games sit at this sort of intersection of 4 different phenomena. So roles, which I mentioned earlier, play, games, and media culture as well. Okay. So in order to understand role-playing games, we need to examine them in the context of these 4 phenomena. So play is a universal behavior. All humans play. In fact, almost all animals play as well. But actually, humans exhibit special kinds of play which we don't really see in other animals, with perhaps a minor exception in certain forms of higher order primates that exhibit some forms of play that are similar to ours. So we engage in pretense play, which is a symbolic form of play where you're playing as if. We see this in little children. Then we also engage in role play. We call it sort of social dramatic kind of play. And then, I don't want to say at the end of this, there's also rule play, which is when people think about games, that's what most often comes to mind. This idea that you're managing your play behavior based on certain rules and agreed delimiters into that activity. And so role-playing games exist along this entire continuum to a certain extent, right? So a 3-year-old role plays, but in the sense of pretense, for example. When they say, oh, my bunny is alive and I can talk to my bunny, or I'm not going to put the bunny to sleep, and those kinds of activities as well. Games are interesting, and role-playing games are interesting because they navigate this distinction between role play as an activity and rule play. It's sort of role play now has rules, and that's what makes it slightly different. It makes it kind of weird, and game scholars prior to D&D coming out made this distinction. They say, well, there's playing make-believe and there's games that have rules. And all of a sudden there's this new game that comes along that is both of those at the same time, and it got really complicated for a while. RPGs also involve roles, right, which are fundamental in our identities, in our self-concept, in our awareness of who we are as we move through life, as we navigate our social relationships and interactions and so on. And so understanding that in a role-playing game, you're already playing a role of a player, and in addition, you might be playing the role of a character, it makes it sort of actually kind of different and kind of weird in ways that we hadn't thought about before. I might be the brooding scientist on the Larp, but I'm also a player. I'm also a conference attendee. I'm also, there's all these things that get layered on top of each other. Okay, so players are not characters, but this also ties into cultural traditions and rituals. Maybe some of you in this room have recently graduated and you had to put on a special robe and attend a ceremony. You were playing a role in a sort of cultural ritual that matters, right? As a professor, I had to wear a different robe, and there's a certain amount of performance that I have to do for my students, right? It creates a special place in time, right? If you go to mass, if you go to a funeral, if you go to a wedding, these are all social occasions where we play specific rules, even within certain rules as well, okay? And also RPGs sit at a really interesting moment. So media culture has exploded in terms of its importance and significance and recognition it gets. And role-playing games kind of sit at the heart of a lot of that. Right? Many of you might have gone to see an Avengers movie. And you say, well, Avengers, comic books, fan culture, adolescent culture, teens, and so on. Like, games are in there, right? They are at the seat of all of those things. They're sort of the heart of fandom in many ways. Okay. In the book, we have this picture, kind of explain that. But we also want to study RPGs because they give us insights into play, a better understanding how do we understand play more generally by looking at a specific case of role-playing games. We can also understand have insights into roles, is that if this is what you do in the game, you can also bring a lot of those insights out into the real world, right? Or the rest of the world if you want as well, okay? We can understand why people behave in certain ways. We can understand a lot about what happens on Twitter right now and in politics by understanding RPGs as well, because we see a lot of times those same behaviors as well. RPGs have been incredibly important and influential in the context of games writ large. In the video game world, which is much larger in terms of dollars, they talk about RPG tropes as a thing, and that it literally comes explicitly from tabletop, right? And also understanding media culture and the role it plays in society as well. In RPGs, we see a lot of experimentation around IP, about governance, about new business models and forms of labor, and so on. So that makes them interesting as well. And I like to think that role-playing games are just intrinsically interested, but I don't think I need to convince you guys of this. So, why the book? Well, we wanted to gather and collect. We wanted to bridge silos across different disciplines. A lot of times, Larp scholars might not be talking to tabletop scholars, might not be talking to MMO scholars, and so on. They're learning things and finding things that can inform each other. We also wanted to create these entry points into other disciplines as well. Role-playing isn't exclusive to games, it's inclusive to those of us in this room. If you're a psychologist, if you're an educator, if you're an economist, if you're a communication scholar, you've all dabbled and talked about role-playing at different moments in time. So we really wanted to give an interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, and transmedia synthesis of the state-of-the-art of RPG research. How's that for a mouthful? So that's sort of this inner circle. Let's talk about these different forms that matter. But at the same time, also look at these other disciplinary perspectives. I'm not going to read them because I'm running out of time, but for each of these, we wanted to provide a short intro to the field. If I'm not a psychologist, well, what is psychology? What does they care about? How are RPGs seen in that field? Why are they interesting for that field? And what kind of work has been done already that might inform the work I want to do in my area? So that was sort of our outer circle. We also had, there we go, a middle circle, which is sort of bridging the gap between the games themselves and these other disciplines as well. So those are the chapters we have chapters on world building, subculture and fandom, immersion, understanding players and the relationship to the characters, transgression, erotic and sexual roleplay, and discrimination and representation. So in the end, that's the big picture of the book, which I know you can't read, but just you can go, ooh, that looks fancy. Thank you. So that's the book. There's a link, the official link. I kind of URL'd it. I don't know how long that'll work, and you can also use that code for a 20% discount. If the book shows up as not available, you can order it anyways. I don't know why. I know that it works. The publisher I think the publisher is having issues, but even though it says out of stock, you can still order it and it'll show up like in a week or whatever. So thank you very much, and my apologies for running over.
Thank you, Andrew, and I can't stress what Jose was saying, about the enormity of this book, and I'm glad that he ran over time because it's a big weight that's off our shoulders, and it's a good book. You should read it. What I would like to talk to you today about is actually research from about 3 or 4 years ago that I'm now seeing as being very interesting with respect to Larp. I did an article on uncertainty in tabletop RPGs for the early years of analog game studies, and now I'm revisiting it with respect to Larp dimensions to see if there are specific forms of analysis that might be of interest to us. And so this is the sort of overview of what we're going to do today. So I'll go over a few premises, then we'll look at uncertainty as a guiding principle of design analysis and some ideological implications of two LARP games. And I'll also say that I'm not just talking about LARP here, but also LARP adjacent activities, which include things like escape rooms, to some degree immersive theater, but definitely also so-called mega games as well as social deception games. And if any of you have thoughts on social deception games, we just put out a call for papers for analog game studies on deception games. So it's something very interesting. These are like games like Mafia or Secret Hitler. But I'm going to turn today first to video games and the infamous Dragon Speech by Chris Crawford in 1992. Chris Crawford was one of the early scholars of game studies. He wrote, I believe, the first scholarly book on games and founded a small conference called the Game Developers Conference. Not bad. But in 1992, he leaves the field entirely, more or less game dev, and then later is ousted from the board from GDC, specifically because he wants to create art with video games, and I quote him here. He says, "I dreamed of the day when computer games would be a viable medium of artistic expression, an art form. I dreamed of computer games encompassing the broad range of human experience and emotion. Computer games about tragedy or self-sacrifice, games about duty and honor, patriotism, a satirical game about politics, or games about human folly." Again, these are the dreams of 1992, right? When he goes further on in his speech, however, we kind of get the 1992-ness, right? His games as art, in Chris Crawford's mind, is simulating people well. What he really wants, and this is things that are they're in the speech, and you can read it or even watch it online. Improved computer representations of human facial expression, artificial personalities simulating hundreds of different human behaviors, so sort of the whole range of different possibilities, like when you're talking to someone that you like, but maybe you like, but like you're also spreading gossip about them behind their back with someone else, and you know, hundreds of different human behaviors. And then also giving people better player verbs that should shoot or give or take a thing. But is this not LARP? Is the thing that he's talking about not something that we in the non-digital realm actually innovated? In some ways, you know, this is my stance then on Chris Crawford's. I don't know if you know this meme at all, but yeah. So this is Chris Crawford's stance on game art, and this is inspired by a conversation I had with Jose last night, where effectively, computer games and LARP are actually quite very much in bed with each other. And I'll even say that LARP can function as a fulfillment of computer games' promise. Brendan Keogh just put out a book called The Play of Bodies, How We Perceive Video Games, which is literally about the somatic experience of video games, how we feel games, and not just and not just quote unquote play them in this kind of disembodied way. And of course, we had our somatic turn in film studies in 2000 2001 with Vivian Sobchak's article, What My Fingers Knew, which is now a sort of canonical work of embodied play. But again, all this work in media studies is ignorant of all this awesome stuff that we're doing in LARP. LARP, of course, relies on player and predictability, and I also, you know, again, I'm including social deception games in there with their level of role play. But then on the right, we have, you know, College of Wizardry. On the left, Secret Hitler, and of course, all of these rely on the unpredictability of the human that Chris Crawford sought so heavily in computers. And of course, as Lizzie Stark has argued with regards to LARP as technology, LARP allows us to, at a very low cost, rapidly prototype social realities. So, the problem is, of course, that film studies has an aesthetics, and even games now definitely have a long-term aesthetic analysis, but LARPs as an aesthetic project, we're trying to get there. You know, to be able to articulate neutrally, without any value judgment or even any genre judgments of any kind, what is going on in LARP. And I've been trying to do that for a while. So these are 4 of my articles related to this. I actually couldn't cram all the images on there. I have things on character sheets, on work in LARP, on futurity in LARP, transparency and safety, and emergence, in case you're interested. We would call a mid-level film theory for LARP, which is a mid-level film theory, again, it's not high theory in which we're then like debating people like Roland Barthes and what is meaning and that sort of thing, or low theory, which is why a film did or did not sell, but rather the mid-level is the historical and aesthetic and social analysis of how films work on their audience, what is the role of a close-up or a jump cut, and then we can begin to say in LARP, you know, what is the role of a character sheet or of a side plot. Right, and this is of course based on primarily the work of David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson, as well as Noel Carroll. So actually we can say yes, there is a LARP aesthetics that we are building, and one way we can do it is again being agnostic of the origin or genre of a LARP. Doesn't matter if it's a Boffer LARP or a mystery LARP or whatever, that we isolate specific characteristics that they share, and that we then build a profile of a LARP based on LARP cultures and game mechanics rather than the advertised content of a game or what we perceive the game to be about based on its advertising alone. again, I use uncertainty then in this way, rather not as a end-all, be-all way of judging games, but rather one tool in our toolbox of a larger LARP aesthetics project. So this is just me continuing to try things out. Based on Greg Kostikian's MIT published work, Uncertainty in Games, which I pretty much use all the time, this is a way of looking at all games as engines of exploring uncertainty. Kostikian argues, and of course Kostikian is a role-playing designer himself, uncertainty is a primary characteristic of all sorts of play and not of game alone. If you think like a programmer, you might say that game is a subclass of play and inherits from play the characteristic of uncertainty. So you more or less have play as a way for humans to engage with uncertainty, to make it their own, and that games then add rules to that. Similarly, George Elias, Richard Garfield, and Robert Gutierrez says, if we had to pick one ingredient that was necessary although not sufficient for something to be a game, uncertainty and outcome would probably be it. And the general outline of Kostikian's argument is that uncertainty is the thing that holds our interest in any given game. It's not the graphics, it's not the so-called gameplay, but actually we have specific dimensions of risk and uncertainty that we are constantly negotiating and dealing with a game. Doubt is therefore what drives our gameplay rather than win or lose conditions. And then of course we can use subcategories that allow us to judge a Nintendo game next to a LARP, next to poker, and we'll just do that right now, I mean, more or less. So this is a way of putting game design and again, that mid-level theory into the center point of the conversation. So here are the 11 flavors of uncertainty from Greg Kostikian's book, and I'm pretty much spending the rest of my presentation turning these then into actionable aesthetic categories for LARP through other games as well. So I'm not going to list them all right now because we're going to go through each one, right? So first of all, performative uncertainty, which is, will I be able to physically execute this maneuver? In video games, Super Mario Brothers, right? If I don't physically execute the maneuver correctly, I die, or I'm punished somehow. But it's pretty easy to get your physical feedback there. But for role-playing games, we have a game like Dread. Dread uses the Jenga tower, now star-crossed, right? But Dread is uses the Jenga tower to articulate a horror game being told by multiple people at a table, and this particular RPG means that if you make the wrong pull and the tower crashes, your character dies. So literally, it's still, am I physically able to perform this maneuver or else my character will die? Boffer LARPs are curiously also in this category, right? So we have foam sword fighting, and also if you have ever played a game called Dances with the Clans, which is a game in which you are being vampire clans dancing off against each other. It's also, am I physically able to execute the right dance moves, right? So all of these are sort of running together. Next we have solver's uncertainty. Can I solve the puzzle here? And so for those of us who grew up in the 90s, of course, Seventh Guest or Eats Munchies, where there is a single correct solution and you need to find it. Some of the time your GM will railroad you in a game like Call of Cthulhu. Another of the times you'll have Mike Young slash the LARP where there is mysteriously, in the middle of a slash game, a puzzle. And characters who have to solve this mysterious Egyptian puzzle. So anytime you have puzzles in a game, it's solver's uncertainty. Player unpredictability is the absolute sweet spot of what LARP has to offer, right? Your players will do all kinds of things. And so this question, how is my play experience contingent on the action of others, I see as the core question driving most design. We can see it in products such as Pokemon Go or Ingress or Shadow Cities, where we don't know where our fellow players will come and nuke our territory. We also see it in Team Fortress. We see it in Amber Diceless Role-Playing, where we have an auction system that brutally pits us against each other. Or we see it in Just a Little Lovin', the LARP as a game in which you will hook up with all kinds of random people, and then they might die of AIDS. So that player unpredictability is a core. I mean, I could put just about any LARP on this slide and say yes, player unpredictability. Randomness. What will fortune give me? And you can say, okay, you've got a randomizer, random dungeon crawl like NetHack, where it's where all the dungeons are randomized. You've got a game like Apocalypse World, where randomness functions on according to sort of 2d6, and none of the outcomes are uninteresting. Or you have randomness like in the LARP, The Long Drive Back from Busan, where you literally have to roll a d4 to see how good your Korean boy band performs at the festival, and that's it. There's no arguing with that die, and there's no gaming that system. You guys might have a wonderful band dynamic, and you will still suck because the die said you sucked. Analytic complexity. What decision will I make given this complex decision tree, right? World of Warcraft. How should I build my character? Europa Universalis 4. What the hell is going on? There's too many variables. I can't keep this all in play. Oh my god, hero. But then again, LARP adjacent, you have things like Watch the Skies, where there are so many different variables and so many different groups all coming together. Hidden information is another foundation of many LARP communities. What information is being deliberately withheld from me? And so you don't actually see your secrets and powers LARPs in dialogue with Minesweeper, but they totally are. Sunshine Boulevard, which I'll skip over, or Hellas Other Vampires, where you don't know who is going to be the first one to kill you. Narrative anticipation. What will happen next in the story, right? Oh no, Eris!
Spoiler alert.
Or fiasco, right? Where you don't know what weird story your player's going to put out, or if you're from the intercon scene, Magpie, who's going to be taken by the Magpie. Development anticipation is kind of a weird one, right? What will be the new additions or new materials? And this is one that I think was very interesting for LARP, right? Where you're anticipating new, say, versions of a popular role-playing game as they come out. You're also going to stare at this new LARP and be like, what is actually going to happen at this LARP? Or okay, they're going to run this new thing, but how is it going to be different than this other thing? And when you're asking that question, that is actually a dimension of uncertainty, right? Schedule uncertainty. When am I going to be able to come back to this game? And I know I'm short on time, so I will wrap up these dimensions pretty soon. But then, from a LARP perspective, you often, of course, you've got things like Farmville where you don't know if you're going to get back to your phone. But then, you have the Beast, or even New World Magical, which is like, I don't know if I'll have the money to go back to a next New World I'm serious. I don't know if I have enough money to go back to the next New World Magical, and therefore I don't know if my character's plotline is going to continue. Or the Beast, right? I know I'm in love with this Beast, but I don't know, to what degree I can still fit this into my schedule. Two more, and then we'll wrap it up. Uncertainty of perception, which is how can I filter out irrelevant data, right? Where's my character in Geometry Wars? It's just simple. Can you see the screen? Can you see what you need to do? Or you have a LARP such as Aaron Vanek Steeds, where you get visual data from the other guy, and you have to direct them, right? And so you're always don't have your own perception. You have to process things. And finally, we'll wrap here on semiotic uncertainty, and I can go through interpretation later in the Q&A. This is, what will my playing this game mean? And especially games that are ruthlessly railroaded. This is, I think, one of the key elements of uncertainty. Gone Home, I don't know, like it's pretty obvious what's all in the game, but it's not certain what you will make out of it. Waco Resurrection, right? I'm going to put on David Koresh's head and play this first-person shooter. I don't know what I'll get out of it, but it'll be something. And for my example here is, of course, The Journey by Frederick Axelsson, where it's pretty well scripted what will happen. This is Cormac McCarthy's The Road, the game, and you will have terrible things done to your character, and it's always almost universally the same terrible things. There's almost no chance whatsoever, but everybody's experience is very different. I'll wrap it right there and give you some food to think of. But again, I guess one thing of my final thoughts was that Crawford was saying LARP-like games can aesthetically challenge video games, but we need to be able to discern the aesthetics of a given LARP in order to do that, and games are designed along these lines, right? So we can then use dimensions of uncertainty to understand what's going on. Thank you very much.
This project, or this study, is part of a larger project about the Forge, this online discussion site. And just a quick show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the Forge? So only a few, so I'll try to explain at greater length than with an audience that will be more familiar. So this is a discourse analysis of a panel, much like this one, that took place in 2010 at an Italian game conference called Internascon, where on my right, your left, Tobias Rigstad, one of the founders of the Jeep Form game design school, was on a panel with Ron Edwards, the co-founder and chief moderator of The Forge, a game design discussion site for indie tabletop role-playing games. And many people saw parallels between their approaches to game design, but also some differences. And so the woman in the middle is Claudia Cangini, the translator, who's translating to and from Italian the English that the panelists were speaking for an audience of Italian role-playing games. And so if you've watched these 13 6 to 10 minute video clips that are the panel, and that are the data for this study, you'll find that back and forth translation makes this one, an interesting moment of cross-cultural encounter, but also kind of difficult to get through. Many people, in talking about it on discussion sites later, said, "Oh, I just couldn't get through it. I just couldn't get through it because of the back and forth of the translation, and it was just awful." And so, but I found it really fascinating, really interesting for what it said about, or how it sort of spoke to this moment of not just a cross-cultural encounter between national identities, but also a cross-cultural encounter between gaming communities. And we all know that role-playing, as we just talked about, is so multifaceted a thing. To have this moment where two sort of spokespersons or advocates for particular communities of play are talking about their perspective, their history, their origins, that's something interesting about the discourse of games can emerge from that. So,
just hit space.
voila. So, what I want to do, or what I tried to do in looking at this moment of encounter, right? This hour-long, hour-and-a-half-long panel, is figure out what were the stories in it. What were the things that each participant on the panel was trying to say. And so, in order to do that, I used Kenneth Burke, the rhetorician, his model of rhetoric known as the dramatistic pentad, and I recognize that. Wait, is anyone here a rhetorician? More or less. All right.
I've read Kenneth Burke.
So you read some Burke, right? And it's dense, and I have a tough time explaining it to my students. I think recently I had a success where I was explaining the pentad to my students, and I messed up. I didn't realize that this slide, which is the audience for that panel looking back at you, was here, right? And so there's an interesting sort of meta thing that's occurring where, but I need to say that in addition to watching the video, I talked to one of the panelists as part of this larger project about the Forge, briefly about this particular incident. I haven't had the opportunity yet to talk to Tobias Rigstad, but our schedules just haven't sort of coincided, but I do intend, before publishing this in any form, to sort of incorporate his perspective as well. So the pentad. So Kenneth Burke alters an alternative to sort of the traditional rhetorical understanding of what's occurring in speech. I'm sure if you've taken a public speaking class, you've heard logos, ethos, pathos as the three, persuasive proofs, all going all the way back to Aristotle. Burke Burke argues that, well, maybe there's something different going on, or we can understand what's going on a little bit differently in sort of trying to understand what people are doing in speech. And that is, maybe they're offering us a world to share. Maybe they are offering their understanding of something and offering that to us in a way that we're invited to identify with it. And so in looking at that, looking at speech in that way, right, he says, well, you know, we can identify these 5 key elements that emerge when we pay close attention to what people say. The act, the agent, the agency, the scene, and the purpose. The act being what occurs, the agent being who is the author of that act, the agency what means they have at their disposal, the scene where it takes place, and the purpose to what ends. And so the book where he sort of elaborates on this is called The Grammar of Motives, and it's called The Grammar of Motives because, he argues, right, in listening to others, we impute motive to it. That's just one of the fundamental things that we do, right? We make sense of what's happening around us, and you know, one of the reasons, this is Burke, this is not me, one of the reasons we believe in God is because we're imputing motives to things, right? And actually, you've heard some evolutionary psychologists maybe talk about, enough, never mind, right? Well, let's not go there, right? But, and Burke scholars argue whether, well, did Burke intend this ontically, that is, as to sort of describe what things, you know, how things really are, like is the world composed of this stuff, or is this merely epistemic, right, in the sense that it's how we know about things. Again, we don't need to go down that route either. They're interesting to think about, to talk about, but for our purposes, or for my purposes, what's useful and interesting about applying the Burkean pentad to this discourse, this particular exchange, this particular encounter, is how it lets us see the multiple levels at which the encounter is taking place, right? And so I'm going to talk about, in applying the pentad, right, talk about at the level of the exigence, that is what's occurring as an event, what is this thing, at the level of performance, that is what is each participant on the panel trying to achieve or seemingly trying to achieve, and then finally at the narrative level. What's the story, what are the stories that each one is telling about the world that they came from that brings them to this panel, right? That said, let me just sort of drive on. I should say, right, that in identifying particular elements of the pentad or particular elements of this encounter as interesting to examine, right? The concept, the Burkean concept that needs explanation is the notion of ratios. And so he argues that, well, okay, you have these 5 elements, these 5 key components that occur that you can identify when listening to what others say. And in any given description or redescription of a speech or an utterance via the pentad, certain relationships, certain ratios, certain of the elements will resonate more strongly. I think of them as like strings that you pluck. That pentad is that pentacular pentad, right? The pentacle, you know, so that each pairwise combination of elements is potentially resonant in the sense that it is potentially problematic and opens up the narrative that's being told to challenge. It's the thing that needs to be nailed down the most in order for us to be convinced by or to identify with what the speaker is saying. So at the highest level, what I'll call the level of exigence or the level of the event, like we can think about the panel as a thing that occurs and that can be examined at the pentadic level, right? And so in this case, the act is this the dialogue or engaging in dialogue or discussion about games. The scene, the panel that they're on at this Italian gaming convention, but the agents, Ron and Tobias, Edwards and Rigsdad, and their purpose being, to engage in this discussion. And so, in terms of identifying, what seems to be important, right, is this notion that clearly what matters is the agents, right, the actors, it's Edwards and Tobias as the sort of representatives or advocates of particular gaming communities, and their agency, the instruments or the means that they are using to, to do that advocacy. And interestingly, right, how they frame it is as their the experiences that they bring, and that's not just within the panel itself, but also in what you might call the paratextual elements, like the guest of honor bios on the Internascon website, where they're identified as special people within this setting. And at one point during the talk, Edwards even makes that clear by saying, "Oh, look, the camera is pointed at us, not at you." And so when Tobias, 5 minutes left? Oh, God. All right, so at the level of what's occurring at an event, you have two advocates for their different communities speaking to an audience of Italian gamers who, it should be noted, are more familiar with indie games of the sort that Edwards espouses on the Forge than they are with Jeepform, the kinds of games that Rickstad is advocating for. And so so even though there is this sort of foreignness, there's also cultural alignment on the level of what games are more familiar to the audience. But moving forward, so I clearly don't have time to talk about the respective histories of Edwards and Rickstad, but I just want to note that as the co-founder of the Forge, Edwards is associated with both particular theories or models of game design oriented around the concept of system does matter, but also advocating for independent game production, creation, publication, right? And so the notion that these games need to be created, a wide variety of games need to be created, is part of the sort of the motivation underlying Edwards' contribution. And Rickstad, on the other hand, is the founding member of the Jeep, the Jeepform play collective, which advocated for a very tightly focused style of play that was invested in creating psychological impacts on players as part of the sort of design objectives. But moving forward, we can see, right, at the level of performance, Edwards being like really closely focused on engaging in dialogue with the audience, and that's to a certain degree that's understandable because of the extent to which they were familiar with his games. He could talk to them, and he felt that he could engage with them. And a audience member at the panel said his recollection was that, well, Edwards was happy all weekend because people were familiar with the ideas that he'd been talking about for many years, but not having to explain, from the beginning, everything that he was talking about was very agreeable, right? And you can imagine Rickstad having the opposite experience, right? Coming and having to explain from scratch, ab initio, if you like, the ideas that he was talking about and made things a little more for him. I mentioned that, on the slide here, it mentions that the agency that Edwards employs is sophistic communication, which is a style oriented towards accommodation, right? He's interested in, there are many times where he will back off from claims that he was making or things that he was offering in order to make some sort of accommodating kinds of gestures or movements. But fundamentally, he was interested in defending the claim that system does matter, right? That was the essence of his contribution to the role-playing game discourse. In contrast, right, Rickstad describes what he did. There's a video where called One Cool Thing, right? Many conventions have them, where someone will take a camera and they'll go around and say, one cool thing that happened at this convention was, and interestingly, what Rigstad said was something like, oh, one cool thing that I saw was not, battling or agreeing with Ron Edwards, right, speaking to the expectations about confrontation that weren't necessarily met, but was instead playing an Italian indie game called Sine Requiem, which was like an Italian post-apocalyptic zombie game. So Rigstad's understanding of his place there seems to be like immersed in or emerging from the fact that he's a stranger there, right? Much more so than Edwards. That he came there, played some games that he thought were nice, tightly focused designs in line with his aesthetic, and so he concludes by saying, "Well, I'll be back," right? But the notion is that as an agent, he's here present in this foreign site and is visiting it. Moving from the level of performance, right, the two different performances, to the level of the narratives that each one told. In Edward's talk, right, in Edward's story, he talks about how in the role-playing discourse of the 1990s, offering the idea that system does matter proved to be controversial, right? It proved to be something that challenged the views that people had. And ultimately, though, the reason why he did that, right, was in order to bring about larger dialogue, right, bigger dialogue. I know I'm out of time, but let me just finish up, right? The creating or restoring the vibrancy of like the pre-1980 game discourse and game design, like game designs, like bring about more varied, more interesting game designs was sort of the vision that he had. In contrast, Rigstad's sort of sense was that, or what emerged from Rigstad's talk is the idea that, well, what we want to do is encourage tight, focused designs. That's what's important, and that's what I'm here to do. So again, there's a lot that I'm glossing over, and I need to close. So I will, but just by saying that what the Pentat does is let us focus at different levels of a larger discourse and identify within it elements that are of interest. So it serves as kind of this heuristic function, pointing our attention to things that are valuable and worth seeing. In terms of examining this particular scene or site, what's interesting or valuable about it is the extent to which it reveals differences in the way that designers and people discussing it understand what it means to play games. Thank you very much.
Keeps the time for questions, so just go ahead and raise your hand and you can direct your questions at any or all of our panel members.
Okay.
What was the most challenging thing for you about making a book of this scope?
So I procrastinate a lot, and this was a project that required a lot of pushing forward and keeping track of things. And I don't want to say that Sebastian or myself were particularly successful at it. The book could have come out in 4 years, is a completely reasonable thing to say, but it was hard to sort of keep it moving forward when you're sort of in the middle of it. You don't necessarily have an exit. So in the academic life, a lot of our work is guided just by regular deadlines. Hey, there's a paper deadline for this conference, there's a deadline for this, deadline for that. And with this book, we had self-imposed deadlines, so it was harder for us to keep that going. Well, at the same time, because it was over multiple years, making sure that we were not forgetting why we were doing this in the first place, and keeping track of the things that we promised to do with it as well. So about that I mean basically making sure that the focus and the force that we wanted was still there. that became harder and harder over the course of the project.
I guess Bill and I will comment also on the book if you wanted to.
Sure.
Yes,
So, Mr. what do you have to say?
One thing is Jose pointed out that we were, that there were all these debates in the listservs, and those debates spilled out into the chapters where a lot of us said, okay, we haven't really had our say on this thing in public yet, and so we're going to do it for the undergrads for perpetuity. And it was Jose and Sebastian said, this is it's an introductory text, and tone it down, whoa there. And so, one of the things is some of the time you'll have a handbook like this where the debates are already kind of settled, and then you just sort of record them. We were still building the field while trying to then summarize the field, if that makes sense. And so the contentiousness, I think, was genuine intellectual engagement, which I'm always grateful for, even if it was tough at the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll just echo that. The one thing that in listening to Jose talk about the notion of collaboration rather than just collection, really popped out to me, because I remember that part of that process and it being, kind of academically or intellectually exhilarating, right? That sort of sense that, okay, we're really, it isn't just, perfunctory review and things like that, but actual engagement with each other and wrestling with, well, how do we do this? How do we collaborate within individual chapters? How do we collaborate across chapters in the review process? And to a certain extent, like making decisions at some level about, well, what's valuable? Like how can we chop out 1,000 words here, 1,000 words there in order to give more room to something that deserves more room? So that was a big challenge.
And I just wanted to add real quick, as one of the collaborators, I thought it was really impressive the way that they managed to balance, everybody managed to balance, and I think the editors had a large part to do with this, the video games, the tabletop, and the Larp in a coherent fashion, so nothing felt ghettoized, nothing felt like it was just like, oh, and yeah, we're gonna have this sort of tangential, so that was very difficult, particularly in game studies where there is such a heavy focus on video games, and it would be very easy to just kind of push certain things off to the corner, or to have a bunch of Larp scholars get in and go, finally, and then not pay attention to video games. So I thought that was done very well.
Thank you.
There's a question behind you, Sam.
So, I'm eager now to read the dragon speech, and I haven't, but I kind of wanted to ask you about it, because it seemed like were you trying to get at something of almost like this crossroads where video games and Larp went this different direction over the issue of almost like the base nature of what is our interaction, and I guess I question about that, as far as like being from the Larp community, should we go back and look at that? At the same time, I had an observation, which was, I was part of a group at Project Horseshoe, which is a game design retreat, but it's mostly video gamers, and I was in a thing specifically looking at dialogue trees. And this kind of came up here, which is like this video game perspective of, is one of the things that we're trying to do in building dialogue trees is a sign of success almost like a Turing test. Does this character feel human? Is that the goal of building a dialogue tree? And again, so it just seemed to me, it's like, okay, there's a major difference in what some people view video games doing and then what we would do. Because the idea that I could go into a game and play with an AI that feels human it's terrifying, right? Like, because I want to play with you people.
Right.
And if I could be fooled in a video game, that's almost like the end of humanity or something, right? Anyway, can you talk about this division? Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, so again, this notion of the computer game that just feels like a Larp, but that doesn't have any people, which is nice, right? And somehow, and so, Trey, you're saying this feels dystopian, and for me, it also asks us the question of how dystopian our Larp spaces as well. Right, where you are creating these kind of artificial environments, and on the one hand you can have these temporary bouts of imaginary play where you do have genuine interconnection. I'd say most LARPs, though, I mean statistically speaking, are PvP and involve or PvP or person versus player versus opponent, but provided by the game master, right? And so there's a competitive element and also a secretive element, and what we would consider in game studies an agonistic element, right? Where the competition drives your engagement, and where then the simulation of an opponent comes into all this, I think is important, because I think that part of what we enjoy about LARP is the chaos, and something that also Crawford wanted the chaos to produce something coherent, right? They wanted and I'm questioning then in LARP if we actually want coherence, but rather we do enjoy all the dangly bits that are there, and we need a language to appreciate that.
Can I make an addition to that? I think there's another point of intersection if we start from LARP, which is those LARPs that explicitly chase the 360 aesthetic, where if it's in the real world, it's in the LARP, where all the props work as they should work and so on. There's no imagination required for that sort of thing. Is also chasing an aesthetic goal that is seen in a lot of video games, which is sort of this graphical realism and verisimilitude. So what a lot of what Crawford is chasing is saying, look, the industry is going towards better graphics, more realistic graphics, photorealism, and I want to do that, but for behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I want to do that for characters that can interact in interesting ways and realistic ways in that sense. And that's where sort of games did the photorealism, and at this point we can say we kind of got there. We're beyond realism, we're at sort of hyper-realism and so on. And LARP has perhaps chased the 360 and then kind of danced with that. I think you go sort of back and forth depending on context and how much money you have. But it's the behavior part where they sort of meet together in a not necessarily a dystopian way.
And then 1, 2, 3. Yep.
I wanted to build a little bit on what you were saying and discussing here, and also add a bit of some stuff from Ron Edwards, maybe relevant. So it seems to me, and maybe I'm misinformed because I don't come from LARP scholarship, I come from more of the RPG scholarship background, but Ron Edwards talks about GNS theory, the gamist, narrativist, and simulationist styles, and it seems to me in talking about LARP design, the focus is always on simulationism, like almost always. Like it's, how do I simulate this character? How do I simulate this world? How do I simulate this experience? Rather than the other possible aspects of games that have been more fully explored, I feel, in maybe tabletop RPG or video games. I was wondering if you had any ideas on, maybe that's just I don't know enough LARPs or LARP theory, but that's what it sort of seemed to me like. I wanted to hear your thoughts on if you think that's true, or if so, why?
So GNS serves tabletop really well.
Yeah.
For LARP, there's not as many. For LARP, you have the additional element of sort of immersion, which is not just character based, right, and character simulation based, but then also. If you take gamism and narrativism very seriously in terms of LARP, then the gamism means you need to make a very balanced competition mechanism in your LARP, which I think is almost impossible. Like Dagger here made a pretty coherent damage system that's carried for a long time, so I guess that's good design.
Well, it's about mechanics, right? Is your LARP heavy on mechanics and gameplay? So a lot of the sort of weekend buffer PvP LARPs will fit in that. We have, I think, rulebook with.
I guess my
Or
example for
Vampire.
that would be like Starship Valkyrie, if you're familiar with
Yeah,
that.
of course,
It would be like a gamist LARP design.
Yep. A lot of vampire LARPs are referred to by some as more gamist than simulationists, for example. And in many ways, that's also tension with Tobias, who's saying, look, I want no rules, no mechanics, no systems. It's all about the experience, which in this context we probably call the narrativist part of it. I just want to focus on the story, the character development, and so on.
And to some degree then, Tobias Rikstad and Ron Edwards are juxtaposed two different categories of narrativism, because in Ron Edwards you create the design and it's a closed system that you can just transport to any convention and run, and the system matters, so it does a thing. Whereas with Jeep Form, you have a really strong game master who's there to direct the thing, and if they don't take that role, it doesn't work as well.
Right, but using techniques and principles that are in and of themselves systemic. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. But I mean, I think the Innernos Con was secretly about the game master role. even, or like, you know, even though there's a design principle, because I think they shared a lot in common in terms of design.
Absolutely, right.
So then for me, like the substratum is, you know, what is the
Yeah, and it's super interesting, right? And talking to Ron's like, well, you know, it was like, it's like shadowboxing, because how can I have a debate with someone who I agree with fundamentally on
Right.
everything? Whereas Rigstats, you know, was much more, no, wait, you know, this is not about system, this is about something else. Even though kind of it was really about system, right? And so I think I'm agreeing with you in terms of sort of identifying, you know, the question about what is system, where do you point to it, it sort of was sort of the subtext of their debate or their discussion. In terms of the applicability of GNS to Larp, that's something that I'm not comfortable speaking to.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm getting at.
I wrote an article about it if you want to read it.
What did you say, Sarah?
Well, I wrote that there's actually 6 categories.
Yeah, that's right.
I personally don't believe like GNS is like the end all be all, but in terms of like how I hear people
Right.
talking about LARP design, like going to this conference, I hear people talking a lot about immersion.
And so, in thinking about, you know, what's going on in play, the thing to remember about GNS, I think, right, is that, and there's a chapter on it in our book, right, where we talk about the difference between ideas of immersion viewed through the indie game lens, right, where it's about sort of this communal appreciation of the reward cycle, right? Like what's being rewarded? What are people going, yeah, this is awesome, right? And so to a certain extent, the reason why the Forge sort of disparages the notion of immersion is because they couldn't see it, that it was embedded in the different creative agenda that people were responding to. Like the creative agenda is a group thing, it's a collective thing, rather than an individual appreciation or an individual design thing. There's some disagreement about that, but ultimately the most practical application of GNS emerges from, you know, looking at it as something tied to the reward cycle and what people are responding to collectively, right? Whereas, you know, the notion of, you know, the Jeep, right, idea about, you know, what they were going for, right, where the game itself, right, the implementation of the game had powerful psychological effects on the players, right? If that's not immersion, what is, right? And so, you know, we argued, or Evan didn't argue this, I did, along with Emily and Eudemus Arvinian, that the Jeep notion of immersion sort of is a product of that drive for psychological impact on players.
So we're going to jump to this next question, but if you want to talk about more GNS, we can have a pop-up on Sunday and read Sarah's article all together, read along. So, yeah, please.
I was thinking, getting back to the previous discussion, I was thinking about the interaction like person versus person and person versus computer, not about LARPs or RPGs, but what would you say about intellectual games? Say, when you are LARPing, when you're playing Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with a computer or with people, will there be any difference in interaction? How do you think? Comparing to the LARPs, of course. Because it's like less emotional from my point of view and more intellectual, so probably there should be some difference.
So right now, the current state of the art, we know that players' experience of a game is different when they think they're playing against other human players. We also know that it doesn't matter necessarily if they're actually playing against other human players. So it's sort of a priming effect to a certain degree. If you tell them they're playing against other humans, then they will interpret and make sense of that experience differently than if you tell them they're playing against AI agents or bots or whatever, or playing with or against, it doesn't really matter. As people's understanding of technology and what it can do changes over the years, as well as technology changing, I'm really curious to know if that difference will continue to exist or not. Right? If people will just at some point treat both experiences the same, whether they're playing against a computer or against a player. Right now there's assumptions, right? So right now, if you think you're playing against a computer and you're playing against a computer, and the computer does something wrong, you can blame the thing. Like, oh man, there's a bug in the system. Look, it did something stupid. It tried to walk through the wall, right? If you think it's a human player, it's like, oh, what is that player trying to do? They're kind of crazy. They're playing in a deviant way, right? They're trying to do something different. Maybe it's interesting, maybe it's not. So the framework which you bring to that experience varies. In 30 years' time, when we have AI that is indistinguishable from humans, I don't know what's going to happen, right?
And I want to add just that you know, part of the outer boundary here is, you know, LARP with AI, right? When will we be able to LARP with robots, and how will that interaction work, and will that be something that pushes beyond, you know, both video games and LARP itself? But I mean, I can say this with a completely sober tone of voice in 2018. So, yeah.
And there are already games that explore that, right? There are LARP-like where you're interacting with computer-controlled agents. And as a player, so long as you understand what the parameters are and if you're not trying to break the system, as it were, you can get really interesting sort of narrative experiences as players. And players go like, wow, that was something new and exciting that I hadn't experienced before as a computer game.
So that's all the time we have. But if you have any additional questions, you can come chat with those guys afterwards, just so we can clear out the next session and get ready. But if we could give them another big round of applause, thanks so much for